Prairie Yard and Garden is a production of the University of Minnesota Morris in cooperation with Pioneer Public Television. Additional support provided by Mark and Margaret Yako Julien in honor of Shalom Hill Farm, a nonprofit rural education retreat center in a beautiful prairie setting near Windham in southwestern Minnesota. ShalomHillFarm.org.
One of the largest species of flowers in the world is the orchid. To date, over 20,000 species have been identified, and they can be found on every continent except Antarctica. In Minnesota, there are over 45 wild species, and they can be found in every environment. No wonder many homeowners have taken up the hobby of growing orchids. Join me on Prairie Yard and Garden as we explore the world of orchids. Orchids can come in so many sizes, shapes, and colors, it's hard to know which plants to grow. Joining me today is Jayme Hennek, an orchid fancier. Jayme, welcome to Prairie Yard and Garden.
Well, thank you for having me on the show.
Tell me, when did your interest begin in orchids?
Well, I started growing orchids in about 1992. I read a book on stating how difficult they are to grow, and I wanted to prove the book wrong. So what I did was I went out and I bought my first orchid, and it's just a small little orchid. And I asked the person at the greenhouse, how long before this blooms? He says, oh, 5 to 7 years. I thought, I can wait that long. Well, I finally bloomed that orchid in 2005. I have probably 200 orchids in my collection. I have received myself as a grower 2 American Orchid Society awards. And I have also gotten 1 flower awarded in the years that I've been growing orchids, and the latest one was January last year. So I'm real excited about growing them. I enjoy talking to people about them and telling them, you know, the different orchids that are out there, which ones are the easy ones to grow, and things like that.
Apparently there's a huge number of species out there, and I would assume most people concentrate on a half a dozen as the major ones that they tend to grow.
There's about 30,000 species of orchids that you would find out in nature, and I've actually got one here that this is a little phalaenopsis here that you would actually find this guy here growing out in the jungle someplace. Just cute little flowers and that on there. And the orchids, mainly the orchids that I grow in that are tropical orchids and that. So these orchids do have to come inside for the winter time. You can't leave them outside.
Well, you said there's 30,000 species. Are we going to find them in Minnesota?
Yes, actually we've got 45 species, native species in Minnesota. And they are still discovering a few, so we haven't found all of them yet. Minnesota is also the only state that has the state flower as an orchid. So the Cypripedium regina, which is our state flower, is an orchid. And typically they bloom from around mid-June to mid-July, and that I think most of them are probably done blooming right around now already.
So that lady slipper, what type of environment does it live in?
The lady slipper net prefers kind of a moist, shady environment. They do like some midday sun in that, but they don't like the late day sun. So somewhere close to bogs is where you're going to find them, something that stays relatively moist. And it's a very slow grower too. For a clump of say you get a large clump like this here, that could be 150 years old. They don't spread very fast.
Well, tell me a little bit more about some orchids.
Well, some of the easiest orchids to grow, Larry, would be the one like Phalaenopsis here. It's also called a moth orchid. In fact, this one here, which is Baldwin's kaleidoscope, this one here has been reproduced more than any other orchid in the world. So they've propagated this thing and sold more of these than any other orchid there has been. And that has to do with the beautiful striping and that's on the plant and that. And this is one that I actually purchased as a seedling. And so I've probably had this one at least 15 years now.
Really?
So the orchids do grow a long time. And with proper care and that, you can get them to bloom like this one here, which the blooms on here will typically last 6 to 9 months.
Will it rebloom then the following year, given proper nutrients and so forth, or has it got to have a long rest period?
Typically, they will bloom the following year. It depends on which type it is. A Phalaenopsis usually will bloom the following year, which they usually start putting out their spike around November. With proper light, proper nutrients, and proper watering, you should be able to get them to rebloom. Although some people may have a couple years before they get it to rebloom, and usually then it has to do with it's not receiving enough light.
This is a Phalaenopsis. What makes it a Phalaenopsis versus some of the other species of orchids that we grow?
Well, Larry, one of the things that probably makes a Phalaenopsis is the way that they grow in that. And I've got a good example here. This Phalaenopsis in nature probably is hanging on a tree similar to this. And what makes the Phalaenopsis is this nice arching flowering that it does. And so that's what people are looking for, is a nice long flower spike with a lot of flowers on, different colors to it. In the short, that's what they are.
Okay.
Another example of it, to be in a larger size, would be something like this here. Now here you've got two different Phalaenopsis. You've got large flowers, different colors. So I mean, there's a wide variety, and then you compare that with a species, and look at the size of the flowers on there. I mean, they're just so much smaller that you have this large array of sizes that you can pick from.
Tell me a little bit about the care that goes into an orchid and to have them looking this great.
Well, Larry, the care for orchids is actually quite simple. You need light, you need water, and you need some food, and you need air movement. Those are the four main things that they need, and probably in that order. People may think that air movement isn't that necessary, but it is real important to have in your display or whatever. But as far as the watering goes, it's pretty hard to tell a person how often they're supposed to water, because it all has to do with their conditions on the way they are growing. In a fir bark media similar to this here that I use, this type of media it's got some sphagnum moss, it's got some bark, some perlite, and charcoal in, and this is what I've been growing in for years. I typically will water once a week with this. But other people in that, they don't care to grow in this. They will use a different potting media. They might be using charcoal. They might be using just sphagnum moss. They could be using perlite or coconut husk, different things like that. There, you're going to water a little bit different. Sphagnum moss, when I grow in sphagnum moss, I might water 2 to 3 weeks, once every 2 to 3 weeks. And you have to test the media. You have to feel the media to find out if it is actually moist or not.
I see we do have a number of different mediums here. Can you give me a little advantage or disadvantage of each one of them?
Well, yeah, I've got several different medias here that we do grow in. Some of these as plain medias. Here's a coconut husk that, you know, if you're out in Hawaii or in the tropics or something where coconuts are readily available, this is what they might be growing in all the time. And they probably do a pretty good job out there with it. But here in Minnesota, we like to take this and mix it with other medias to make a media. So we might mix coconut husk in with, say, a little bit of perlite. And we might mix it in with some sphagnum moss.
Okay.
So that it holds moisture a little bit better, but yet it drains. You can add a little bit of charcoal to it, small charcoal, depending upon root sizes.
What's the value of the charcoal?
The value of the charcoal would be that it's added for drainage, and it also has keeps the soil, or I shouldn't say the soil, but the media fresher, so it doesn't get sour on you. It helps eliminate soil or salt buildup as long as you aren't over fertilizing.
Well, that would bring me a question. If you talk about salt, do I have to be concerned with the water I'm using? Can I use softener water to water here, or do I buy some osmosis water at the store?
Well, that's a good question, Larry. Typical typical softened water from a water softener, we don't recommend that you use. With the exception of if you are softening your water with potassium chloride instead of sodium chloride. If you're using potassium chloride, that's perfectly fine to use to water your orchids. I like to recommend rainwater. That's soft water already. I collect rainwater. That's what I typically water my orchids with year-round. I will store 300 gallons of it for the winter in it to water the orchids. Probably the next best water to use would be reverse osmosis water. You can buy it. You can have your own reverse osmosis system in the house or whatever, but those would be the two good ones to use. Plain city water, if you're living in a city, that seems to work pretty fine, pretty good. The only thing is that I would recommend that you leave it sit out for the chlorine gas to dissipate from it. Well water is another good one to use. So if you're out in the country, your well water is perfectly fine to be watering your orchids with.
You know, we got the different mediums and so forth, but I want to know, where should I put orchids in my home? Can I have them in bedroom, or they got to be in a very sunny location? What's the ideal thing?
There's several places you can keep them in the house. You can grow them in the windowsill, and if you're growing them in the windowsill, what I recommend is an east-facing window to a south-facing window. Your probably least window that you want is maybe west, unless you get late or not a whole lot of sun through it. North side is borderline on almost too dark to get them to reflower in that. But your east and south windows are the best. And what I recommend is that you would take, if you've got several of them, you would group them together, similar to this. And by creating that little environment, you keep the humidity up around there. So you're making it its own microclimate. And that way, you have the higher humidity around there without having to raise the humidity up in the house and that all the time. And with that, in order to keep that humidity up, what I like to do is we use something like this. It's called egg crating.
Mm-hmm.
And these are typically in 2-foot by 4-foot sheets. And you can get that at your home improvement centers and that. They're typically in 2-foot by 4-foot sheets, very inexpensive. And I'll take it and I'll cut it typically to size to fit in the tray to cover the whole tray. And then you put water in here just below the top of the egg crating and set your plants on there. That way, as that water evaporates, it keeps the humidity up and that around the plants for you.
Well, then tell me, what is the ideal temperature for orchids? Is it change when we want to bring them into bloom?
The ideal temperature for orchids really ranges a lot on which orchid you're growing, because temperature ranges in reality will be roughly 32 degrees up to 90 degrees. Phalaenopsis, say they like temperatures between probably about 65 at night to maybe 80, 85 during the day. A lot of your other easier orchids kind of like that same temperature. I like to tell people that if you're comfortable, your orchid's comfortable. You know, if the humidity gets too high and it's hot out and you're uncomfortable, your orchid plant might be getting uncomfortable too. If you're cold, your orchid plant might be getting cold. So kind of like to use the range that, you know, what we enjoy is what the orchids are going to enjoy. When you start getting to different temperatures, then you're probably getting more into specialized work.
Okay. Well, that's good to know, and just might go out and buy another orchid.
Well, I hope that you're doing that. And recommendation when you buy orchids is go out and look for one that's in bloom, because now you know what you're going to get. Look for one that still has some flower buds that are not open, because now you know this guy is going to bloom for a long time for you yet. So you don't want one that's already fully opened, and you know, something that pleases you. And again, you know, what do you like? Do you like a big orchid? Do you like a small orchid?
Well, I see we have maybe half a dozen orchids here, but you talked about having 200. Where do you keep all of those?
In the summertime, I keep them outside in what I call a lath house that I built to store them in. And I also hang them in the trees and on wires net alongside my garage net where they get more light. I put them outside because they grow better. So typically they would go outside around Memorial Day weekend, and they would come back in around Labor Day weekend. That isn't to say that's gospel, that's a guess. This year they came out later because it was cooler. A few years back they stayed out well into September because it was very warm in that. So,
is there a minimum temperature in the fall where I've got to get them in? I mean, they go into a shock or something?
Well, yes, in a way there is. Minimum temperature, if you've got a couple of nights that drops down into the 40s, you're probably okay. But if it starts getting constantly down into the 40s, that's the time that you want to make sure that you start getting them in. There again, unless you're growing cymbidiums, which cymbidiums want temperatures down to 32 degrees. They're a little bit more difficult to grow because they need that cool temperature, so they might be put outside already in March or April.
Sure. But that's a specialty orchid that you probably wouldn't start with.
That is correct, and that isn't something that you would start with.
Well, can we go take a look at your little lath house and see what you have?
Sure, let's go. Well, Larry, this is my lath house. This is where I keep the majority of my orchids for the summertime. As you can see, there's a large variety in here.
Yes, I'm very impressed. It must take you an hour just to water.
Actually, it doesn't. These guys here, I rely on the rain to water. If we don't get some rain, I might take the garden hose and I'll just go over it, and it doesn't take very long to water. I don't water each individual pot separately, and that just kind of the whole bunch at one time and done with it.
Well, I noticed this plant here, and the blooms are done, but we still have a spike. What should we do with that?
Well, Larry, this is what I like to tell people to do. First of all, you can leave the spike and not do anything. And eventually you'll have a growth start here, which will rebloom again. Now, if the spike starts to die back, then you want to cut the spike back. And what we tell people to do is you count up 3 nodes. There's little growth nodes on the stem here that you will see. And if you count up from the bottom, you go 1, 2, this spike here that started on the 3rd one, typically we'd cut it off just a little bit above there. And usually in about 6 weeks, and that spike would start to grow another flower spike off of there. And it would take about 6 weeks probably, and it would be blooming again for you.
Would you refertilize if that does start growing?
Well, As far as fertilizing, most of your orchids are fertilized year-round. We use a very weak solution to fertilize, usually 1/4 strength, and I like to fertilize mine every time I water, so that they're constantly fed. In the summertime, when they're actively growing, I will probably give it full strength, because they're able to take the nutrients up a little bit better. But I like to fertilize every time that I water.
Okay. Well, I see some other orchids hanging on the side of your shed there. Can we go take a quick look at them?
Sure, we can go look at those.
I have a question. I really like the look of mums, but I'm wondering if there are any new varieties I can try this year.
Yes, there are. Mixed in here with our daylily collection is our mum collection, and there's a whole series that has just come out recently in the past 10 years or so, the Mammoth series, developed by the University of Minnesota. So these are very hardy in this climate. They come back reliably every spring and get really nice and thick and are full of flowers like this. And one of the nice things about this series of mums developed by the U, the Mammoth series, is that they're self-branching, so they don't need pinching. They get covered in flowers at this time of the year in the fall, and they're very dense and compact, sometimes referred to as cushion mums. And also these mums are very hardy in the Minnesota climate.
Ask the Arboretum Experts has been brought to you by the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum in Chanhassen, dedicated to enriching lives through the appreciation and knowledge of plants.
Well, Larry, this is my Vanda collection, and what makes these unique is they don't grow in any media at all. They just sit in baskets like this, and then you got these long, gorgeous roots that soak up the water and the nutrients in that, and that's the way you'd find them growing in the jungles.
You're kidding. How are they getting any nutrients hanging in the air?
Well, they get their nutrients from bird droppings and that would fall into the crevices of the trees, and when it rains out and that the water would just flow down there and just right into the roots, and it would soak it up.
Well, that means you got to have some birds in your house.
Well, no, you don't. These guys here, that I might take a bucket of water with some fertilizer in, and I might just dip them in the bucket of water and soak them. But this is also another orchid that is very easy to grow and bloom under fluorescence in an average house. I thought that they would be more difficult to grow, but I actually found that they're real easy to grow.
And they got a kind of unique shape. They're kind of two-dimensional?
Pretty much so, yes. And these here flowers sizes can range from, say the size of an eraser head, and that up to 6 inches across, and that so, and any color that you can think of, just about.
Well, I might have to go look for one of these. They intrigue me.
Well, unfortunately, Larry, these orchids are a little bit more difficult to get a hold of. You need to be going to specialty shops and that to get something like this, or a orchid sale or something that you might be able to find some at.
And what resources could I use to find those shops?
Well, the one place that I would recommend, Larry, is on the internet. It's called orchidmall.com. That's going to give you resources of all the supplies that you can get a hold of, plus all the plants that you can get a hold of, and that there's many different companies that are listed there, and get them through the mail, and that most of these places will ship year-round, and I haven't had any problem getting them in the middle of February here in Minnesota.
Really? Okay. And what about books? What might you recommend for a nice reference?
A real good one, if you're interested in the native orchids of Minnesota, is this new book, Native Orchids of Minnesota, from the Department of Natural Resources. It's the latest version. It lists all 45 orchids that are native to Minnesota here, tells you where they grow and a lot of the growing conditions about them.
Okay.
Another good magazine, and this is a subscription magazine, is to the American Orchid Society. So it would be aos.org. This magazine you get monthly. Different stories in there every single month, and probably one of the best orchid magazines that's out there in order to find out about growing orchids. A couple other ones that I have are Ortho's all about orchids. Just some basic information that I feel that anybody should have, and that just gives you the basic stuff in that on growing. You also have Ortho's Complete Guide to Orchids. Again, a little bit more depth on there. Tells you about repotting, tells you about fertilizing, and dividing, and all the different things. That just real good pictures, real good information in this book. And of course, there's a complete guide on orchids from Miracle Grow, and that I find is real interesting, in that with some real good information.
Those are easy to find, I would suspect.
They're easy to find, and most of these you can find in your big box stores. If you're looking for orchids in that, I recommend that you go online to orchidmall.com, and you can look up for the supplies or orchid plants there and pick out a nursery and pick. There's also a couple of them in Minnesota and that down in the cities that do sell orchids, and that prices are a little bit higher, but if you're a first-time orchid grower, recommend that you go to the big box stores and put down a couple of bucks and get yourself a couple of orchids. You're going to lose some, but I recommend that you try again.
Sure.
They're great to have.
What happens to all these plants in the late fall and so forth? You got a special place in the home?
Yes, Larry, I do. I've got a grow area in the house. From when I started out with under or in the windowsill, and then I advanced to growing under fluorescent lights. Then I decided to build myself a kind of a cabinet to grow them in, and I wasn't happy with that. And now I built a physical room that I grow them in. So it's about a 10-foot by 13-foot room that I have LEDs, fluorescents, lighting in there that I grow them. And this time of year, and it's pretty much shut down. There's a few seedling orchids in there because they're a little bit tender and that to be putting outside and that. So that's the area that I would grow put all these plants that you've seen, pack them in there for the winter and
enjoy.
Enjoy is right.
Well, Jayme, I want to take this opportunity to thank you for a most interesting show talking about orchids. I hope my audience appreciates what goes into producing these beautiful flowers.
Well, Larry, I enjoyed doing it, and I hope that the audience net goes out and buys some orchids and enjoy them like I do, because they are a lot of fun.
Additional support provided by Mark and Margaret Yekel-Julien in honor of Shalom Hill Farm, a nonprofit rural education retreat center in a beautiful prairie setting near Windham in southwestern Minnesota. ShalomHillFarm.org.